So we're going to start chapter 7 today. Chapter 7 is a lot like chapter 6. We're going to use the same 4-step method throughout chapter 7. So again, it is identify the cost pool, identify the cost driver, determine the allocation rate, and then determine the allocation. So we will continue to use that, but what we've been talking about, what we're going to do is drill down further into the organization. So if you imagine an organization, right, that would have these various cost centers, like let's just say IT, housekeeping, finance, and then they have these profit centers, let's say imaging, surgery, medicine, right? And we've talked about how we allocate the cost centers either using direct method, right, or step down. Either way, we've got to take the cost that goes to the cost centers and allocate it to where the revenues of the organization are being earned. But if we talk about something like imaging, I talked before about how imaging, well, I talked about how some of the cost centers could actually be more complex than, say, a single thing. Like IT might be you might have an IT section that does like all your technology, laptops and iPads and all that stuff that's deployed throughout your organization. So they might have that section. And then they might have the electronic health record section, which is really a different mission. And so you might actually have multiple cost pools, say, within IT or, finance, from my own experience. In finance, I had three or four divisions, depending on the organization I was in. I had a budget division, I had a manpower division, I had a cost accounting division, and then depending on where I was, some organizations, I also had the revenue cycle division as well in my responsibility. And those are four very different missions. And you would want to use different cost drivers potentially to allocate those, because some organizations use more of those services than others. Well, it's also true, we can take that same kind of perspective and we can say, these profit centers, they're actually more complicated than just saying, oh, imaging, because imaging could break out into X-ray, say MRI, and say oncology, right? And so we actually have, say, 3 different operating areas, and then surgery might break out into multiple lines as well. We might have ortho, general, ENT, for example, right? And so you might have multiple services. And so if you go to Wentworth Douglas, they have their profit centers organized into what they call service lines. So we've, for example, I know this guy, John Bouchain, who some of you may get to know if his department has taken interns the last couple of years, and John is over the, what do they call it? I'm using this again, I'm blanking on what they call his section. It's basically orthopedics. But what they roll up under orthopedics, they roll up the orthopedic surgery mission, they roll up physical therapy, occupational therapy. Physical therapy and occupational therapy are in sort of a rehab section. They have a section for physical medicine, which is like the orthopedic. It is doctors who study the musculoskeletal system, but they don't do surgery. These are called physiatrists. So they're basically like orthopedic surgeons, except they don't do surgery. They kind of somewhere between a very high, highly trained physical therapist and an orthopedic surgeon. So they're kind of your last resort before going to before going to orthopedics. So they've got these different sections within that orthopedic service line that have fairly different cost structures. If you think about it, or the actual surgeons, orthopedic surgery section is a high cost area with the supplies are very expensive. You're using OR time, and so forth. Whereas say physical therapy, you are, you probably actually have more space because if any of you been to a physical therapy, at two physical therapy, say at a hospital, they usually have a pretty big space, like the size, at least the size of this classroom, if not bigger. I know the one at Wentworth Douglas is large. And they've got, so they've got a large physical footprint, but their costs are relatively lower. And they use fewer supplies, and the supplies they use are much less expensive. And so you could think about, these different sections within a single service line. So if we imagine these profit centers in the middle column here as being our service lines, you can then say, well, there's really like another level down, right? And so in the imaging service line, they might have some shared resources and some overhead and some direct costs. So there might be some costs incurred at the imaging center, at the imaging service line level, for example, that are shared across all three of the services that are within the imaging service line. So there might be a imaging administrative director, something you might eventually aspire to, say 10 years from now, who oversees the whole imaging service line from an administrative perspective. Alex, what's her name? Oh, Jen Alex. I always get her. She's one of those people with two first names. Jen Alex is a grad. She's like a 2013 grad, I want to say, of HMP. And she is, or was, she may have left now, but she was, at least until recently, the administrative director for the Department of Radiology at Boston Medical Center. So a really cool job for somebody who's like in her early 30s. Being an administrative director is a pretty significant at a medical center is a pretty significant role. And Jen's done really well for herself. But she would have overseen all of these kind of functions within the Department of Radiology or the radiology service line, however they're organized there. So her salary would be, would go to the imaging, would be at the imaging level, but she's providing services to, say, each of these different sections. And so we have to come up with a way of allocating her costs. So her cost would be a direct cost to the imaging center, right? But not to the X-ray, to the MRI, and to the oncology sections within imaging. Her salary would be something that has to be allocated to each of those subsections. So, but at the same time, we would also have stuff coming kind of from the hospital level, the IT support, the housekeeping support, the finance support into imaging. So we have what we've been working on, which are the big cost centers, allocating those to each of the service lines. But then at the service line level, you're going to pick up some additional overhead. An administrator, for example, a medical director. So a lot of these service lines will have a medical director who is so for example, in imaging, it kind of obviously would be a radiologist, right? Who would have a part FTE as the medical director and a part FTE as a provider doing whatever, reading x-rays, reading MRIs, doing procedures on patients. That's a common thing to see. And when I say FTE, we all understand what that is, right? Full-time equivalent. So we talk about a full-time equivalent as being 2,080 hours, 40 hours a week for a year. So when we talk about a part FTE, we're talking about allocating his time between doing administrative work at the service line level and then allocating his time across these these individual services. So that's something that has to be done on a regular basis as well, right? So there's a doctor who's actually probably, any one of the radiologists that's assigned to this imaging profit center is probably having his time or her time split across multiple services. And then you might have a radiologist who is medical director who's not allocating part of his time, who is allocating part of his or her time to the administrative function rather than to providing medical services. So that then becomes an overhead, right? So these direct costs at the service center level become overhead at these next level down. So it's really the same math we're going to use, but we're going to use a couple of different techniques to get down to the service level from the service line. So let's call this profit centers. These are our service lines. And we'll call these our services. Try to be consistent about that. Okay, so that's kind of the overarching organization of Chapter 7. I want to talk about some other theory, though, that's now going to overlap with what we've been doing in economics. So, because ultimately we're going to try to talk about, we're going to take the information that we just talked about, where we're talking about allocating costs, and we're going to talk about making decisions about pricing, and whether we can afford to be in a market. So we've talked in economics, we've been talking about in Chapter 11, we've been talking about perfect competition, right? What are the elements of perfect competition? What is it that's true about the demand that you face? If you're a provider selling into a perfectly competitive market, what does your demand curve look like? It's a horizontal line, right? Why is it a horizontal line?
Like the market price, the global price is the maximum.
Right. It is the price, right? So demand equals price equals marginal revenue, right? Because we've got some global or very large market from which this price emerges, right? So this price is the presumption here is you're selling into a marketplace where in a perfectly competitive market, you're selling into a marketplace where there are so many providers and so many buyers that no one individual provider, seller, or buyer can influence the market price and market quantity. But that quantity is so big that you can sell as much of it effectively. You can sell as much as you can produce into that market at that fixed price. But your actions can't affect the price. You are what we call so this is perfectly competitive. All buyers and sellers are price takers. Okay. So the idea is you can sell, you as an individual firm can sell as much of whatever this is as you want into this marketplace, but you're going to get P per unit. You're going to get that P per unit, and that P per unit is not determined by anything you do. It's determined by the global market or the larger market, the larger overall market. It may not literally be a global market, but the assumption here is there's a big enough market that there are enough competitors that if you tried to raise your price, somebody would undercut you and you wouldn't be able to sell anything. So as a result, you are a price taker. So the assumption here is you are a price taker. In a perfectly competitive market, it's true that both buyers and sellers are small enough relative to the overall market that they are all price takers. It might be that you are not, it might be that this condition on behalf of the buyers, it could emerge that there is one very large, on the part of the sellers. So what we're imagining, what we are currently doing in chapter 7 is thinking about ourselves as sellers of a service, right? So we are thinking about ourselves, for example, as a hospital with all these different service lines. And so we're trying to sell into the marketplace. It might be that there aren't an infinite number of buyers. There might just be a handful of, there might be a very, very large buyer, for example, Medicare, right? Whose price we don't have any control over. Whatever we do, it doesn't matter. Medicare sets the price. Somebody, the HHS down in Washington, D.C. sets the price that's going to be paid. They make some minor adjustments to locality. Remember, we worked with a GPCI number that modified our bill a little bit to give us a little more RVU here, a little less RVU there, right? Depending on our market. So the HHS basically sets that number and says, take it or leave it, providers. And so in this case, in the case of Medicare, it isn't that there's an infinite number of buyers that's doing that. It's that there is one very, very large buyer who basically says, take it or leave it to you as a provider. And if you don't sell to Medicare, somebody else will. Or Medicare just doesn't care. One way or the other, it doesn't matter. The outcome is you face a fixed price for any of your given services, and you can't change it. You could also, in that same line, if you're a, one man, one woman, physician practice or nurse practitioner or PA practice, very small practice, maybe just a couple of you even, you're going to be trying to sell your services, and most of your patients are going to have health insurance, and you're going to be happy to get them. And you're going to hope that you can get more commercial insurance than you get government insurance, namely Medicare and Medicaid, because private insurance, commercial insurance pays better than the government insurance does. But if you're a very small practice and you're trying to sell you're here in Durham, you're a standalone one man, one woman practice, for example, you're a family practitioner, and you're hanging out your shingle here in Durham. and you're negotiating and you call up Anthem Blue Cross of New Hampshire, which is one of the smaller Blue Crosses, frankly. But they're bigger than you by a lot, right? They're selling to providers all over the state. And not only that, they know that you're one of many family practice providers in the greater Seacoast area. They have what we call market power, which is to say they get to set the price and you have to either take it or leave it. So it could be that the price emerges, as we talked about in chapter 11 of our econ text, from a global market and many buyers and sellers. It can also be that you still face this same fixed demand curve because you have a monopsonist. So not a monopolist, M-N-O-N, monopsonist. Easy to say, monopsonist. Okay, a monopsonist. So what is a monopoly? What is a monopolist? We all played the game Monopoly. What is a monopoly or a monopolist? Sean. How so? Why do you have complete control? Let me reframe that.
Why?
Yeah. What is it that gives you complete control? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Help Sean a little more. What makes a monopoly? Most properties. All right. Let's frame it in the term of the game. Yeah. Sort of. Yeah. You own the market. You are the only provider or seller in the market. A monopolist is the only seller in a market. So a pure monopoly means you are the only seller of a product in a market. There is nobody else selling what you sell. That's a pretty rare thing to see. And when it happens, the government usually steps in some way, in the United States at least, the government usually steps in some way, shape, or form to kind of regulate that. So for example, I don't remember when they broke it up, but AT&T, American Telegraph and Telephone Company, AT&T, that's what they were originally called, was a monopoly provider of telephone service in the United States. If you had a telephone in your house, you rented it. You didn't own it. You rented it from AT&T. And then you paid them a per minute, fee for making phone calls. And then and the government regulated this and ultimately told AT&T how much they could charge, which was frankly too much, but they were able to charge. They couldn't charge whatever they wanted because regulators came in, but they were a true monopoly. They were the only provider. And by the way, part of the deal with the government was nobody else could compete with them. Like they had this monopoly. At first it kind of emerged, but then the government stepped in and agreed basically to terms with AT&T that the government would regulate the price that they could charge, but then the government would also prevent anybody from competing with them. So nobody could compete with AT&T for local phone service. Then eventually, we broke them up into what became the baby bells. So AT&T got broken up and they were able to keep their long distance service piece, and then their local services were broken up into regional, what we called the baby bells. And so like you had, I can't remember what the one up here in the Northeast was called, but it was something. Northeast Bell, I don't know. This was all back when everybody had landlines, right? So these are and then they had a regional monopoly, but we had competition for long distance phone service. So then you could pick your long distance server. You couldn't pick your local provider. And so that was a monopoly managed. It eventually became managed at a regional level rather than a national level. So managed by, there would be one for the Northeast, one for the Southeast, one for the Southwest, one for the Northwest, one for the center, so it was like 6 or 7 of these baby bells. But you could buy your whatever long distance carrier you wanted and contract with them. So that's where you had AT&T was competing, MCI, Sprint. These were all like back in the 80s and 90s, that was a big deal, was trying to find the cheapest long distance service carrier. And my wife and I were living far away, from our family back in the early 90s. And so we used to kind of regularly check the rates to how much it would cost to call home to New Hampshire, and we were paying upwards of 25 cents a minute to call home from, Texas to New Hampshire, for example, 25 cents a minute. Think about that. You want to call mom and dad, and say, hey, it's going to cost you 25 cents a minute. And today you guys have your cell phones and you can call and talk on the phone for as long as you want. It used to be with the local phone service, you'd have free calling within a very narrow band. Like if it was had phone service in Durham, you might be able to call Durham and Dover for free. But if you wanted to call Portsmouth, you got a minute charge every time you called Portsmouth from Durham. So think about that, what it was like back then. So these are examples of monopolies, right? So the initially AT&T was a government sanctioned monopoly. Then it got broken up into the baby bells. And that was also government sanctioned. And then eventually, as cell phones started to emerge, the regional carriers all just kind of fell apart. And how many of you guys don't have a landline in your house now? I'm just curious, like home, we're at home. Yeah, most of you, yeah. When we moved here we had a landline in Texas, and when we got here, we're like, everybody has their own phone. It's like in your pocket all the time. Like, why do we need? So we've just never had since we got here, we haven't had a landline. And so technology broke up that hold that these monopolists had. But most monopolies, when they're actually effective, are a partnership between a private entity and the government. They don't last unless the government agrees to that. Another example is electric, and there's sometimes good reason for this. Like, how do landlines work? Think about it, like a landline. I have to literally run a line over land to your house so that you can make a phone call. That's a huge amount of physical investment. And we don't want 47 different companies running lines all over the place, right? And so it kind of makes sense to be for the local government to say, Sophie, you're going to be the monopolist for landlines in Durham. And because we don't want to have, Jasmine setting up her lines and Linda setting up her lines and DeLuna setting up line, we're just going to give the monopoly to Sophie, and then we're going to guarantee you a certain rate. And if you can convince people to buy their phones from you, right, you'll run what you have to agree to run wires to every house, regardless of whether they buy service or not. But then if they do, we'll guarantee you a rate, and we'll keep everybody else out of the market, right? That's how monopolies actually tend to work. It's really hard to get a durable monopoly without government support. So how many guys use Internet Explorer? when you go onto the internet? How many even know what Internet Explorer is? It's on your, if you have a PC, it comes installed on your laptop, right? So back in the 90s, Microsoft was sued by the federal government because it had a monopoly, because it was exercising monopoly over what do you call those? Internet Explorer was supposedly this monopoly on web browsers. Yeah. So they were supposedly had a monopoly on web browsers. But like none of you like when you go on, what do you use? Safari, Chrome. Yeah, I use Chrome all the time. Firefox. I mean, like there's Firefox. There's a bunch of them now, and hardly anybody uses Internet Explorer. You probably have to use Internet Explorer for some government. You know, if you're like going on certain government web pages, it'll only work on Explorer. But almost nobody uses Explorer. But back in the 90s, Microsoft got sued by the federal government saying you had a monopoly on Explorer. And by the time the case went through, everybody was already using something else anyway. Like by the time the government finally like got it, whatever its victory was, everybody was already using something else anyway. So it was kind of, it's hard to hold on to it. They were dominant in the market. So that's what I'm trying to say is they were dominant in the market. Like in the early 90s, almost everybody used Microsoft Explorer, except for a few folks who were hanging on to a couple of the other ones, right? But they had like, 90% of the market share for, 90% of people who were logging on to the internet were using Explorer. Within a couple of years, that was gone. So the point being, Microsoft's so-called monopoly was not durable. It was really just temporary dominance in the field, and technological advances, and the fact that frankly Chrome works better than Explorer. As soon as there were better options, or Safari works better, pretty much everything works better than Explorer. And so, as soon as there were other options, people ditched Microsoft and went to ditched Explorer and went to something else. So monopolies tend not to be durable unless the company can get a partnership with the government. So not that long ago in your lifetime, Facebook, there's a lot of noise about Facebook being a monopoly. And I'm guessing, given your age group, probably some of you don't even go on Facebook. You go on Snapchat, which I think is kind of dying now too, right? Everybody's on Instagram, which is actually a Facebook company, or TikTok, right? Giving all your information to the Chinese government. Good for you. They're our friends though, don't worry. So Facebook clearly, Facebook had a dominance for a period of time, but it's not anywhere like, most of you don't probably do much on Facebook. Some of you do. It's a bunch of old people like me hanging around on, it's like your grandparents are on Facebook, right? Not you. So these things tend to naturally evolve. Now, Mark Zuckerberg, not that long ago, went to Congress and was making overtures to Congress saying, yes, we're a monopoly and you should regulate us. Now, why would he do that? Well, because of what I just said. How do you get a durable monopoly? You get the government to regulate you and keep everybody else out of your market. So what he was looking for was, yes, you can regulate me, but then you have to promise to keep everybody else out of my market. Right? So he was looking for favors. Okay, so monopoly, one buyer, right? And that one buyer in the market, one seller in the market. Monopoly is one seller. One seller. So AT&T back in the 60s through the 80s, early 80s, was a I mean, maybe it was the 70s. Um, you know, 50s through the 70s, I think actually was a monopoly on local phone service, well, phone service, period. Then they got broken up into the Baby Bells, and there was some modest competition there, but not much. And then in the 80s, the federal government said you can't have a monopoly on long distance anymore. And that's when we had the long distance carrier wars. And so you eventually see, you only see monopoly as being durable when the government steps in and regulates and prevents other competitors from coming in. And so you have one seller, and when you have one seller, these people have what we call market power. And what I mean by market power is the ability to set prices in your market, right? So a monopoly, single seller, has market power. And I asked you, well, what's a monopsonist or a monopsony? Well, if a monopoly is a single seller, then a monopsonist would be a single buyer, right? So single buyer. So market power can in a true monopoly, there is a single seller. So think about AT&T back in the 60s. If you want a phone, there's one option, AT&T, right? And the government keeps everybody else out of the market. Monopsony would be a single buyer, right? And so everybody's trying to sell to the single buyer. There aren't as many, there are relatively, I'm trying to think of a good example of a monopsonist. There are some in the agricultural sector, I want to say, where like everybody has to sell their milk to the milk collective, for example. I mean, I'm not sure on that one, but so for example, I think raisins in California raisins, I think if you are a raisin farmer, you have to sell all of your raisins to the raisin collective. And then they manage the market and they sell it out for you. So you as a raisin farmer sell to the collective and you take that, whatever the price is that the raisin collective is going to pay, you have to take that price. You don't get to choose. You can't sell it to somebody else. Legally, the government will stop you from doing it. And then the raisin seller turns around and makes the market for raisins, but you don't get to choose who to sell it to. So true monopoly, single seller; true monopsony, single buyer. A lot of hospitals have some degree of what we'd call monopoly power, right? Because they tend to be, because of the level of investment involved in building a hospital, the amount of resources it takes to build a hospital and the staff, it tends to be just, if you're in a small town, there tends to be just one hospital, if you're lucky that you have one, right? So you think about like, the AVH that I always talk about up in Berlin, like it's a small enough community that there's going to be one hospital. There's not going to be two hospitals. And so if you shrink your market enough to think of, Berlin and maybe Gorham and a couple of other small towns around, like AVH basically is a monopoly in that area. Now, Now, of course, you could drive, right? Like you could drive, there are other hospitals within driving distance, but they have some monopoly power. They have some market power to set prices because the next closest hospital is probably, a good half hour, 45-minute drive away. I'm not exactly sure. Memorial is about an hour drive from Berlin, right? Memorial down in uh, uh, North Conway. So as a result, Berlin, AVH in Berlin has some market power because there aren't a lot of other hospitals around them. Right. And so they're able to set higher prices as a result because you don't have choice. But that's why we get into a lot of regulation. Why hospitals in particular face a lot of regulation is to prevent them from abusing their kind of semi-monopolistic power. Who's got monopsonist-like power in healthcare? Who has market power from, there are no true monopsonies in healthcare, but there are some who have market power from being very large. Insurance companies, right? So we have some very large insurance companies, and there tend to be a handful in any given state, right? That basically provide all of the, provide the vast majority of the coverage for the state. You of course have Medicare and Medicaid, but then you have like Cigna in New Hampshire. You have Cigna, Anthem, Harvard Pilgrim to some degree. A handful of very large relative to the state. Importantly, relative to the sellers, right? We have insurance companies tend to have market power because there tend to be relatively few of them, and they own all the customers. So they represent all of us as customers are represented by the insurance company. The insurance company is basically our buying agent, right? They negotiate the prices with the providers on our behalf. So you can think of insurance companies, right? Are what we might call buyer's agents. And so they collect together, right, all of us patients, right? All of us patients, and maybe we have, there's our hospital, right? Some little cars outside of it, parking lot, right? Maybe a tree. How's that for art? Yeah. All right. So that's our cute little hospital in town. And then the little dots are us, our patients. Well, if all of us are trying to negotiate with the hospital, we've got the one hospital, right? The hospital's like, there's one of me and there's a bunch of you. And so if you want my services, this is how much you're going to pay. So it gives them a lot of market power because they're the only seller in the market. So what does the insurance company do? Well, it comes along and it says to us who would be patients, hey, I will negotiate with the hospital on your behalf. You pay me a monthly premium. And then when you go to the hospital, I will cover your bills. And so what we'll do is we'll get together and we'll form a unit, right, with the insurance company. And so now that equalizes our negotiating power with the hospital, right? So when it was just us individually, the hospital could basically set its price. It could say, this is the price, take it or leave it, but this is what the price is going to be. And along comes and we're all like, big hospital, we have to do what you say, right? If we want care, we'll just have to pay whatever you say. And then the insurance company comes along and says, hey, buy our insurance and we will negotiate with the big bad hospital, right? And you'll get better rates. And so what they do is they pool all of us together into one buying unit, and then they negotiate with the hospital and the doctor offices, right? And all that stuff for us. What that does is it gives us, through our insurance company representation, a lot more market power. And so we can push back against the hospital's ability to set rates. Well, the problem then is this hospital gets together with this one over here, right? And it's also got its tree. There's some cars in the parking lot, right? And now this hospital gets together and becomes partners, or Mass Gen Brigham, right? And now it's bigger than the insurance company. So the insurance company says, well, there's this other group of patients over here that we're kind of going to that hospital. So we'll pull them into our group. And now we're big, right? And so it's this kind of war of size that we've been seeing over the last 40 years or so, of the hospital is big, and, you know, and maybe there's a limited number of doctors and there's lots of patients. And so the doctors and the hospitals, because they're big, they have market power, you know, or there are relatively few of them relative to the number of patients. That's really a better way of thinking about it, is relatively few providers, many patients. The many patients are acting on their own. And so the hospital and the doctors can basically have market power. They can set the price, right? Well, then the patients start buying insurance. There's a reason why the doctors lobby, the AMA, came out against medical insurance. They did not like that idea at all, right? Those of you who took 401 with me, we talked a lot about this. Historically, they did not like that idea. They lobbied in Congress against it for years and years and years, right? And with good reason, because once the Blue Shield really is the original medical insurance for, you know, insuring for professional fees, got together, they started to tell the doctors, here's the price we're going to pay, you know, and we're not going to pay the price you used to charge. We're going to pay this price. And the doctors are like, wow, okay, well, we won't take your insurance. And then they suddenly found their waiting rooms empty because the Blue Cross is like, you know, Dr. Rachel is no longer in our no longer takes our insurance. So you need to go to see Dr. Nishimwe, right? If you want to be covered by our insurance. Dr. Rachel is no longer covered by insurance. If you go to see Dr. Rachel, you have to pay out of pocket. But if you go to Dr. Nishimwe, she'll take our insurance. And so Rachel suddenly found her waiting rooms empty, and Nishimwe had lots of new patients. And so the doctors didn't like that. And so they started pulling together into larger practices so that they could negotiate better rates with the insurance company. And we had this kind of back and forth, where first the insurance company got bigger, then the medical practices came together, then the insurance companies got bigger again, and then the medical practices joined up with hospitals and became part of a healthcare system. Then the insurance companies got bigger again, right? And then the Affordable Care Act got passed, and we talked about how that sets the limit on medical loss ratios. You have to have a fairly high medical loss ratio, and that pushed out, in some ways, the AMA liked that because it pushed out a bunch of smaller insurance companies, but then that just created monster, ginormous insurance companies that could survive. So companies like Humana, United Health, we now see there are very few. There used to be these mom and pop health insurance companies. They don't exist anymore. Instead, what you see are just ginormous insurance companies, and now they can negotiate with the hospital. So what we have are very large actors in healthcare. We have for the most part, we have very large actors on both sides. We have very large insurance companies, and we're seeing the growth of and consolidation of the healthcare market in providers as well, right? I mean, for those of you from the Boston area, there aren't that many standalone hospitals left. It used to be they were all pretty much, I mean, it wasn't that long ago. They were pretty much all standalone, right? Like Newton Wellesley used to be its own hospital. Now it's part of Mass General Brigham, right? I mean, it wasn't that long ago that Mass General and Brigham were separate entities, but that came together, what, in the 90s. And now they're just gobbling everybody else up. So basically if you're gonna go to a hospital in the greater Boston area, you're either gonna basically go to a Mass General Brigham hospital or a Beth Israel Lahey hospital or a Steward hospital. And that's about it, right? Like everybody's part of something now. And the reason that's happened, and that's happening in New Hampshire too. When I first got here, most of there's 26 private hospitals in New Hampshire, 26 acute care hospitals in New Hampshire. I'll say that. Almost all of them were independent, right? Wentworth Douglas was its own thing. Exeter was its own thing. Dartmouth Hitchcock owned Cheshire, and Alice Peck Day, which is an itty bitty hospital up in the North Country there. Catholic was its own thing. Elliott was its own thing, right? Now you're seeing this massive consolidation of almost nobody is left standing alone. Boston Children's is part of Mass Gen Brigham. So and Mass Eye is its most recent kind of add-on in terms of like large player. So in New Hampshire, you're seeing this crazy, like it feels to me like musical chairs, like people keep taking away a chair and everybody's kind of like cramming together, trying to get a partner before the music stops and you go bankrupt. But it's very much an issue of market power and trying to be able to be a price setter or a price taker, right? Trying not to be a price taker and trying to be a price setter. So you can have that happen through either monopoly or monopsony, right? Monopoly is the one we talk about more often, but monopsony is also really relevant in healthcare. Monopsony power, I should say. There aren't that many true monopsonists, but there is monopsony power, and that's the insurance company trying to get bigger to be the sole buyer so that they can have more power to set the prices. Does that all make sense? All right. So we're also talking about this in econ. So there's an overlap here between the classes. And this is very much the world you are graduating into. So we talk about price takers and price setters. So these are your monopolists, monopsonists. Right. Okay. When you are a price setter, ideal is you want to do full cost pricing, right? This reflects all costs, variable, fixed, or providing a service. Plus profit, which is kind of one of the costs, right? So we want to set a price if we have the ability to set a price, we want to make sure that we're covering not only our variable costs, right? So our marginal costs. If I'm going to do one more thing, right? Marginal cost. If I'm going to do one more thing, what does it cost me to do that one more thing? That's the marginal cost, right? One more. I want to be able to cover my marginal costs, which are usually my variable costs, because my fixed costs aren't changing. When I do the process, the power rule we did yesterday, what happens to my fixed costs, my costs that are sitting alone as constants? What happens to them? They go to zero. Very good. Because they're fixed. They're not changing when I do so. When I'm trying to figure out what is my marginal cost, if I have a fixed cost, it doesn't change when I do one more. My rent doesn't change if I do one more visit. And so I ignore it and it goes to zero. When I'm trying to figure out my marginal cost, my fixed costs, I ignore those. But in reality, if I'm trying to figure out what the full cost of doing something is, I have to include in covering those fixed costs. So I've got to cover the marginal costs plus the fixed costs, right? Plus I've got to make a profit. I'm not doing this for fun, right? I've got to be able to pay my bills, but I also want to be able to take my trip to Florida, right? So, if I'm doing full cost pricing, I'm going to wedge in some profit. So full cost pricing. And ultimately, that's what you've got to do in order to stay in business. If you can't cover your full costs in the long run, and we're going to talk about this tomorrow in econ, so it's a beautiful, the timing is really lovely, because we'll be talking about short run and long run shutdown conditions. In the short run, you'll keep producing as long as you can cover your marginal costs, right? So let's say your full cost of providing a patient visit, which rolls in your fixed costs. We'll get to that in a little bit, but let's say if you're going to cover all your costs, your fixed costs, your rent, your salaries for your administrative staff and so forth, you've got to charge $100 per visit. But let's say the marginal cost of actually doing another visit is like $20 in supplies. And an insurance company comes to you and says, I'm not going to pay you $100 per visit. I'll pay you $50 though. Do you say yes to taking on an additional visit? Well, you may as well, because they'll pay you 50. 50 is more than 20, and it'll help to some degree cover your fixed costs. But you can't have all of your patients be the marginal payer, right? You have to have enough patients paying over $100 in order to stay in business in the long run. In the short run, 50 is more than 20, right? If your marginal cost is 20, and they're offering you a price of 50, 50 is greater than 20, right? So you're better off taking that 50 than not taking it. But that's not covered if your full cost is 100 per visit, because what you're rolling in is your fixed costs. You're going to have to find that extra money someplace else to cover the rest of your rent and your salaries. We'll come back to that in a bit. So marginal cost pricing. Remember, marginal cost is the cost of making one more, right? In this class, it's usually going to be the variable cost per unit. It's not going to be in econ. We're going to be more complex, right? But in this class, it's pretty much the variable cost per unit. You can set a price as long as the price is greater than the marginal cost, right? You might take one more. you might do this when you've earned enough revenue to cover your fixed costs. You can then take lower cost, lower paying insurance company, insurance payments, right? So if you've already covered your fixed costs, your rent, admin salaries, right? Then you can think about setting price at marginal cost. So let's say I'm out here at Q1. Am I making a profit? This is chapter 5. Yes, Kayla says, yes, I am. Why am I making a profit? How do I know? Right, at Q1, I find the Q and I say, at this quantity, am I making a profit? I just draw a straight line up. And if my total revenue curve is above my total cost curve, which it is at this point, this gap is my profit, right? So let's say I'm at Q1. That means I have passed what? This is my, what point is this? Break even, right? This is my break even volume. At the break even volume, I have covered all of my fixed costs, and now I am moving into making a profit, right? I've brought enough revenue in to cover both all of my fixed costs as well as any additional variable costs. So at the break even volume, I've covered my fixed costs. So I've earned enough money at this point, at this volume, I've earned enough money to pay my rent, pay my fixed salaries to my administrative staff, for example, my nurses, anybody else who is full-time and doesn't earn their income based on how many RVUs they're making, right? When I cross that point, now I'm making profit because I have broken even. I have covered all of my fixed costs, and everything after that is profit. So let's say I'm out here at Q1, and let's say that my variable cost per unit is, let's say it's 20. We'll just stick with that number. Let's say it's 20, right? And I had been making, all of my insurance up to that point was paying, say, 100, right? So all of my visits up to Q1 earned me $100 per visit, and they cost me $20 per visit. So I had an $80. What is that? What is the difference between the revenue per unit and the variable cost per unit? Is called the contribution margin, right? So revenue per unit minus variable cost per unit is my contribution margin. So I had a contribution margin of 80. So every visit I did, I had $80 in contribution going towards first paying my fixed cost, then towards profit. So at a price of $100 per visit, I'm earning $80 in contribution margin every time I do an additional visit. So I'm out there at Q1, fat, dumb, and happy. I'm making lots of money, right? I'm in that zone of profit. I'm out to the right of my break-even volume in that zone of profit. Now along comes a insurance company and says, "Hey, we've been sending our patients someplace else, but we're willing to direct them to you instead. This would be additional new visits to your organization. We're willing to send you all of our patients, but we see that you're currently paying that The insurance company you're currently working with, they pay you $100 per visit. We don't do that. We're going to pay 50. We know that you have the capacity to do it. So you are still within your relevant range for your fixed costs. So let's assume at Q1, we say, yes, we'll take those additional patients. What happens to my total revenue line at Q1? I'm going to get some additional quantity. So I'm going to keep moving out to the right, but I'm now getting $50 per visit instead of 100. What happens to my line? How do I draw that line relative to the line that's already there? What's its slope going to be? 50, right? Because additional visits, I'm going to earn $50 per visit instead of 100. So up to Q1, the slope of the line is 100. But now I'm going to pick up these additional visits, but it's going to be $50 per visit, right? So the line is going to be kinked, right? It's currently going like this. It's now going to get flatter, and I should have made this one much flatter, with a slope of 50, which is still steeper than a slope of 20. It's hard for me to draw that. So you should imagine that at the kink point, at the Q1 point on the total revenue line, that slope becomes significantly flatter than it was, but it's still steeper than the total cost curve. So for all the visits from Q1 to the right, these additional visits, what's my contribution margin going to be? 30. How'd you get it? 50 minus 20, right? So now I'm getting up to Q1, I had 100 minus 20, 80. So Q1 plus, I'm going to have 50 minus 20, 30 contribution margin. So as long as I have a positive contribution margin and I've already passed my break even, I may as well take on the additional work because it's all profit. How low could I go? If the insurance company came to me and said, we'll send you additional workload, it's not going to take away from the other, your pre-existing workload. What's the lowest price you would be willing to take before you said, no, I'm not taking your patient's insurance company? Right. You wouldn't go. Right. Well, it's not, you're to the right of the break even. I'm saying additional work. So I'm going to pick up additional quantity past here, right? What's the lowest price I would be willing to take? So 50 works. 50 is 50 minus 20 is 30. That's giving me a positive contribution margin. What if they said something less than 50? How low would you take? How low of a price would you take at Q1, assuming it's additive quantity, Sean? 21, right? So basically anything more than 20. Because 21 would give you $1 in contribution margin, and $1 is better than 0. Because if you don't take any, you get 0. So as long as you could get something more than 20, you'd take the additional patients. You wouldn't be thrilled about it, right? But you would take them as long as you had additional capacity. So you're within your relevant range for your fixed costs. You would take the additional patients. So you could go as low as 20, right? At 20, you'd be like, no. Right at 20, you'd be like, I could take them, I could leave them. So anything more than 20, you'd say yes. At 20, you'd say no, probably just be like, no, that's not making us any money. So I'm not going to do that. So hospitals function like this. Hospitals have a kinked total revenue line. Not the fun kind of kink, the boring kind of kink. So let me draw cost with red, that'll be easier. So I've got my fixed costs, right? Hospitals have huge fixed costs, big expensive buildings, lots of equipment. What? So total cost, right? The cost of taking care of a Cigna patient that pays 100, for example, is the same as taking care of a Medicaid patient that pays, say, 20, right? Or 20, let's say 25. So for the same visit, a Cigna patient comes in and we collect 100. Same level of visit, same 99213, right? We charge Cigna $100. We charge Medicaid 25. That's about the ratio. Like in reality, that's the real ratio, about the ratio that like Wentworth Douglas collects. So let's say that's Q Cigna, right? And then we got Q Blue Cross for our, and this is our total revenue curve. And Cigna pays, say, 100. Blue Cross pays, say, 75, right? And then at this point, we've broken even, right? Here's our break even point. I did a little too early, but it doesn't matter. So we know that we broke even with Cigna. So we're into our break even zone. We're making from Cigna to Blue Cross, this additional quantity we get with Blue Cross, right? So this is up to, here is our quantity we get from Cigna. From here, from Cigna to Blue Cross is the amount we're getting from Blue Cross. For the visits we got with Cigna, we're getting $100 per visit. That allows us to break even, right? And then Blue Cross is just making money hand over fist. And then Medicare comes along and they pay, 40. And then the state says, well, you've got to, you're a not-for-profit hospital. We expect you to see our Medicaid patients and we're going to pay 25. And we say, okay, we can take some Medicaid patients as long as we're within our fixed cost, right? Now, we take some Medicaid patients. And so you can see how the total revenue line is kinked progressively downwards, right? Now, it's unlikely that they would be able to survive if they were entirely paid by Medicaid, right? It's unlikely they would be able to generate enough revenue to get to that break-even point. It would take them a lot of visits to make to the break-even point at $25 per visit. They could do it, assuming that this slope of the total cost curve is 20. Yeah, they could do it. So they'll take Medicaid because the marginal cost of doing an additional patient is 20 and Medicaid is willing to pay 25. That still gives them a contribution margin of 25 minus 25, right? What a hospital will say is, you'll hear them say is, we lose money on every Medicaid patient. It's kind of a lie. And the reason they say that is they say the average total cost of providing all these visits is, say, if we calculated the average total cost, right? It might be, let me just make up a number, say 50. So what they say is the average total cost is say 50, right? Because when you average in the fixed cost and the variable cost over this quantity, the average total cost per unit is 50, but in reality, the marginal cost is only 20. So for each additional patient, they're spending $20 to take care of the patient. If you average in the fixed costs on every unit, it's 50, right? But you can see way back here, they broke even, right? Way back here, they broke even. And so as long as they're covering their marginal costs, they're okay. So hospitals take Medicaid patients as marginal cost, as marginal cost patients. They're taking Medicaid patients as long as they can bill enough to cover the supplies and any additional costs that that are incurred to take care of the Medicaid patient. They won't take additional Medicaid patients if the marginal cost exceeds the payment that they get from Medicaid. And so this idea of different insurance companies paying different amounts is referred to as, well, we call it cost shifting. This is an important concept in healthcare. Cost shifting, what we're doing is the Medicaid patients are not really contributing all that much towards covering the fixed cost of running the organization. The Medicaid patients are contributing a tiny amount, right? That $5 over the marginal cost. So if you're getting 25, the cost of caring for them is 20, you're keeping $5 in contribution. That's a tiny amount relative to, say, the $80 in contribution that you're getting from the Cigna patients, right? So what we're doing is we're shifting the cost of paying for all the infrastructure of the hospital, the building, the administrative staff, all the EHR, all of that is really covered by your Cigna patients, right? And by your Blue Cross patients. And then the Medicare and the Medicaid patients, if we had to run this hospital on just those, we wouldn't be able to do it because we wouldn't get enough contribution margin to cover all the stuff that we have to buy, all the expensive equipment stuff. So what we do is we shift the costs of the kind of overall organization to the better payers effectively, right? The better payers are effectively paying for the building and paying for the equipment. And then the low-end payers, the Medicares and the Medicaids, they're just barely covering, especially the Medicaid, they're just barely covering their marginal costs. There are, but not by much. So if you looked at the whole scope, you'd say, well, it costs $50 per visit. Yeah, kind of. It really costs $20 per visit. And then you've got to cover all this fixed cost. So as long as you have a profile, a mix of payers, a good payer mix, you can use the better payers and shift the cost to them and provide care to your lower payers. All right. I'm going to go to my office. I'll be there for an hour or so. If anybody wants to come by and see me, got questions, I'll be available. I'll plan to do the same thing on Thursday. So if you want to go over either econ or finance stuff on Thursday, I'll be in my office after class.